I'm your host, Julie Palumbo, and today we have back with us Matt Dewar of Journey 30K, and he is going to talk to us about the impact of mindfulness in education. So welcome, Matt. Thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me again, Julie.
So why don't we kick off with you just telling us what your experience has been like in dealing with mindfulness in education?
My experience with mindfulness in education goes back about 7 years now, 8 years. Kind of a dark experience where we found out that a student had come to school in the morning before school and gave a bunch of his belongings to some of his friends, and then just as class was starting, walked out of school and across the front lawn of the school and put himself in front of a train.
Oh, wow.
And the teachers were notified via email that this had happened. And so I was going into my freshman, he was a freshman, and I was going into I think it was my third period freshman class. And I didn't know that they knew or that they were going to know because we had just received the email. What I didn't know was that about 5 of his best friends were all in my class.
Oh.
So I walked into this classroom with 21 freshman students, just absolute emotional triage. And as an educator, you want to talk about feeling inadequate and unprepared. I mean, there's no lesson plan for dealing with that. And so navigating that experience, and that was a really difficult time for our community where we had basically the same incident just like that happen 3 times in about 2 months, 2.5 months.
Wow.
And then there were a number of former students during that year who also did similar things. And so it became this moment for our school to really think about, what are we doing? And, you know, at the end of the day, does it really matter if you can check off all the boxes on the rubric of academic achievement if when our students wake up in the morning, they don't like their lives, and they don't know how to live their lives? And so from that dark time, we came together as a school and as a community and really thought about how can we better serve the emotional needs of our students. And so that's taken many forms. We've started a class called Wellness for Life, which is now a mandatory. It started as a pilot, and now it's a mandatory class, a required course for all incoming freshmen.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, and so every kid comes in, and it's a year-long course, and it teaches them everything from executive functioning to stress management to introduces them to what we call tier 1 supports, which are like social workers in the building, counselors, etc. We even introduce them to their social workers and counselors and all that stuff.
Wow.
And so it's a wonderful opportunity as kids are coming into the school to kind of have this point of contact with them, to let them know that it's okay if things get difficult. We have resources in place to help you. In addition to Wellness for Life and a whole host of other things, in the last 2-3 years, as the well-being coordinator for the district, I've developed and started to implement a mindfulness program for the district.
Wow. And is this for just students or teachers and students as well?
Great question. It is for both faculty, staff, and students.
Great.
Because when surveyed, both faculty and students were asked, you know, what's the biggest obstacle to your health and well-being? And across the board, stress, anxiety, etc. And so just culturally, we're really good at redlining and just pedal to the floor and go faster, 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 we're awful at slowing down. I sometimes with my students compare it to, on ESPN2 at like 1 a.m. in the morning, they have those drag car races where the two cars go like 0 to 200, and then they have those parachutes that shoot out. Well, we live like those drag cars, except we don't have parachutes. And we're just out of the gates and we just go. And when we don't have strategies to slow down, it's almost like the law of physics: a body in motion stays in motion until something else acts on it. And usually when you live like that, it's something that's going to stop that forward movement is not going to be something that's healthy.
Right.
So
if I like to think of it, I love that analogy with the two race cars and the parachute. So it seems like mindfulness is almost like the parachute.
Yes, absolutely. It's a psychological, emotional parachute that helps restore this necessary balance between activity and rest. It's become so distorted. I think really in the last, it's been distorted for a long time, but really in the last 10 to 15 years with personal technology, personal technological devices, etc. We're just constantly going. And one of the exercises I do with students is we talk about the autonomic nervous system and how it's broken down into the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. And the sympathetic system is all about activation and fight, flight, freeze, and faint. And the parasympathetic is rest and digest. It's the restorative aspect. And we do all sorts of assessments on how active are we sympathetically. And most students, one real easy exercise just practically is just breathing only through your nose. Take in 3 full breaths and exhale 3 times just through the nose. On the 4th one, breathe in your nose. And then when you exhale the 4th time through your nose, extend that exhalation for as long as you can and time it.
Oh, wow.
And this is actually an exercise that reveals, it's called a CO2 tolerance test. It comes from the free diving community where divers go under, etc. Well, they've actually studied it now, and it's also a really good indicator of how stressed you are. It reveals your ability to push carbon dioxide out of your body. So anyways, we do this in class. I do it with teachers. It's super easy. If your exhalation is under 20 seconds, your body is in a state of high sympathetic overdrive. You are that race car with no parachutes.
Wow.
And it's such an easy thing to do. So we take this kind of test, and then we do a retest later in a couple weeks where we work on identifying some parasympathetic activities that we can do to calm down and slow down. And mindfulness obviously is probably one of the most effective activities for just down regulating sympathetic activity. So
that's awesome. Now, you mentioned that your program, Wellness for Life, is for students and faculty and teachers. So what role do the teachers play in this within the classroom?
Good question. So Wellness for Life is just a program for the freshmen, but the mindfulness program for the school is for both faculty and students. And that's such a good question, because so many teachers think, and this isn't a criticism because they're well-intentioned, but they love to talk about mindfulness. They love the idea that students are going to benefit from it academically, emotionally, etc. What they often forget is that they need to do it. And ultimately we teach with who we are before we teach any skills and any content. We teach with who we are. And if we can't embody the mindfulness principles that we're trying to engender in the students, then the research shows that's not going to be a sustainable mindfulness program. So a big part of the program has been really starting with teachers and making sure that they're able, one, just to manage their own well-being. We actually created a professional development model that looks at three things with the faculty: teacher identity. Who am I as an educator?
Yep.
Before I walk into a classroom, and when I walk into a classroom, am I teaching with what I value? Teacher well-being is the second part. Do I take care of myself as an educator? And how is that manifest in my classroom and in my instruction? And then the last part is classroom experiences. And that's the more technical aspect. How do I arrange learning experiences through the context of the student's total well-being? Mm-hmm. And so if teachers don't have a developed, consistent, committed practice to taking care of themselves, to reflecting on who they are, etc., it's going to be really hard to teach mindfulness in a classroom, because kids are, this is the one just amazing thing about teaching, is that, and it's probably one of the most difficult aspects of teaching, is that when you walk into a classroom filled with a bunch of teenagers, they sniff you out so fast. They know exactly where you're at. Like there's no,
that's true.
there's no hiding. They know who you are, and they know what all your buttons are. And so if you're authentic with your practice and with your own experience of mindfulness, even if you're a beginner, teachers often think they have to be some expert. No, often you're an expert in being a beginner. And being an expert and being a beginner can be so valuable, because even if you're a beginner, you're an adult beginner. And so just the perspective of being an adult, struggling with mindfulness, struggling to get your 5 minutes in, struggling to deal with the stress of your family at home and balancing that with work, whatever, all of those experiences can be utilized and channeled into teaching moments for the students. So it's got to start with teachers.
I love that. Now, is this a form of behavioral management when you talk about this mindfulness?
So that's a common misconception, is that, and one of the reasons why teachers, I think, seek mindfulness, is they have this misconception that somehow if students are practicing mindfulness, they're going to be these well-behaved, well-mannered, very dedicated students suddenly overnight. And that's not the case at all. It's not a behavioral management technique. And if you teach it that way, again, kids will sniff that out and they will reject it. Because the last thing any teenager wants is to feel like they're being manipulated.
100%.
And that something's being externally imposed on them. We were all teenagers. We know what it's like to have, mom or dad or any adult, a coach, a teacher, try to push certain things on us that we weren't necessarily invested in or wanted. So I think you got to be really careful when implementing it, that you're not using it to create some unrealistic version of a student or a classroom, because it's not going to do any of those things.
Interesting. So it's more of an internal thing than an external thing.
Yeah. And I shouldn't say it's not going to do any of those things. I should say if you authentically engage in the process, that's the key word, because process is everything. Process is the destination.
Yeah.
Then good things will happen as a byproduct of that process. But if you try to create these outcomes in advance of the process, you've just distorted and shallowed the process immensely. And I think teachers really need to be, and administrators really need to be aware of that when they start thinking about creating and implementing a mindfulness program, that you really have to embrace the process. And it might be messy, and that's okay. You just got to work your way through it.
That's great. And, you mentioned a few things about potential challenges. Teenagers could smell out when they're being deceived, or, maybe the teachers are preaching this, but they're not walking the talk. What is the most challenging thing that you have experienced in implementing a mindfulness program?
We are addicted to activity. And I think it's symptomatic of, we have this conception of self-value that's based on doing. That if we're not doing things, we're of no value. And that our self-value is constantly in relation to, or in proportion to, what we achieve. And so that fundamental conception drives, I think, a lot of the pathology of modern society. And so when you're talking about mindfulness, you're saying you need to slow down and be quiet. And stillness and silence aren't achievement states. What can you achieve when you're still and quiet? I'm not doing anything, right? And so this is how we become those drag race cars without parachutes, is because we think this fundamental dimension of life, rest and recovery and connection, is somehow a waste of time because it's not productive. And so I think the biggest difficulty is walking people through that initial turbulence that comes from being still and quiet. And if they can just get through it, and Dan Siegel, who's kind of a guru in mindfulness for kids, I think he's at UCLA. He has a wonderful meditation where he talks about, it's kind of a guided imagery / meditation where you're on the surface of the ocean and it's very wavy. And as you go through the meditation, you slip down beneath the surface of the waves. And then you're 10 feet below the surface. And there's still movement, there's currents. And then you slip down to 20 feet. It's more still. Then you slip down to 30 feet, 40 feet, 50 feet. And all of a sudden, there's this profound stillness. We have that profound stillness inside us. What we don't have are the tools and the right framework that will allow us to slip beneath the turbulence of the surface. And so many of us think we have to stay at the surface in order to live and to be of value. When in reality, I would argue real living and real value and real connection is something much deeper down. And so I'm rambling, but that's the hardest part, is just walking with someone or diving with someone beneath that surface. And once they see it and feel it for themselves, then that's it. You don't need to do anything else, because then they realize it's actually there. But when they're on the top, it's only you telling them that it's there. They haven't experienced it yet. And so one of the most, I think, profound experiences I've had as an educator is working with students on an individual basis, where you see them experience that stillness beneath the surface. And I don't think there's anything better, because I don't know that there's any life skill that's more important than the ability to do that. So, of
course. And lastly, as we wrap up, I know that, mindfulness is such a buzzword these days, and everyone's kind of using it in different ways and interpreting it in their own manner. What do you want our audience to take away from the concept of mindfulness and how we should apply it to our everyday life?
I think I said this in our first video together about just mindfulness and well-being. I think it's important to remember the etymology of mindfulness. Brings us back to a Sanskrit word that actually means to remember, and that mindfulness is to remember. And so you say, well, to remember what? It's to remember to come back to the moment, to the present, because all the things that we want, purpose, meaning, connection, joy, all of those things only exist in proportion to the amount of time we live now. And if we're constantly in the future or constantly in the past, and we don't remember to come back to the present where life is actually happening, we're not actually living. We're kind of in automatic pilot. And so I think that's it, is just remembering to come back. And it doesn't matter how far or how long you've drifted from the present. It's always right here with your breath. So if you feel like you're a million miles away from yourself, your breath kind of welcomes you home every moment. And so I think that would be the core takeaway of mindfulness. I could go on and ramble, but I won't. That's good.
No, that's great. And you've walked us through, like you mentioned, the first interview that we had was just about mindfulness as a whole, and our last interview was about mindfulness in sports and for athletes, and now within the classroom and for both the students and the educators. And it's very apparent that mindfulness is really important in every aspect of our lives, and you don't necessarily have to be a student or an athlete to benefit from it. So I thank you so much for walking us through that and kind of clearing up some of the misconceptions that we could have about mindfulness, and really taking it a step forward in being still and finding a gift in that.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed dialoguing about something that is and continues to be really important to me. So I appreciate it.
That's great. Thank you so much, and I'm sure our viewers enjoyed as well. And thank you everyone for tuning in to another episode of Disrupt Health. I'm your host, Julie Palumbo, and I will see you next week.